our next speaker comes to us from the U.S. Department of Justice. Michael Kades is a Deputy Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division with a focus on civil enforcement. Prior to coming to the U.S. Department of Justice, Michael was Director for Markets and Competition Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. His research focused on competition and antitrust enforcement with an emphasis on consumers, wages, equity, and innovation. He testified before Congress multiple times and authored several reports and articles on antitrust policy. Prior to joining Equitable Growth, Michael worked as antitrust counsel for Senator Amy Klobuchar on detail to the Federal Trade Commission. He worked on the CREATES Act, the Holocaust Expropriated Act, Recovery Act, and the Trade Secrets Protection Act, all of which Congress enacted. He was also the primary staffer at on the Merger Filing Fee Modernization Act and the Consolidation Prevention and Competition Protection Act. Michael spent 20 years investigating and litigating antitrust actions as an attorney at the Federal Trade Commission. From 13 to 15, he was a deputy chief trial counsel for the Bureau of Competition, where he participated in a number of merger investigations and litigations. From 2006 to 13, he served as attorney advisor to Chairman John Leibowitz, and he oversaw the commission's strategy to address anti-competitive patent settlements, worked on the 2010 horizontal merger guidelines, and advised the chairman on antitrust issues. From 97 to 06, he was an attorney with the Healthcare Product Services. He argued in the case Sharing Plow and in the South Carolina Board of Dentistry before the commission, as well as appearing in federal court. He played a leading role in FTC versus Milan, in which the commission obtained $100 million in disgorgement. While at the commission, he received the Chairman's Award and the Paul Rand Dixon Award. Kades is a graduate from Yale University and the University of Washington Law School. And before he took this position, you might recall at one point we mentioned that there are about 6 new scientific and economic and legal reports that were countering the years and years worth of propaganda from our opponents. Michael Kades happened to be the author of one of those handful of brand new reports that just came out that supports our positions with respect to the Packers and Stockyards enforcement. So Michael Kades, please come to the stage. In other words, before he took this position, he was already working on your behalf in terms of supporting the very positions that you've been fighting for the past several decades. So, Michael, thank you. It's all yours. Thank you very much.
Well, those lights are bright. So I do want to make one sort of apology. My official biography is long. That has nothing to do with me. When I got the job, they were like, okay, write up the biography that we'll put on the website. And I tell you, it was like 200 words at most. And they were like, the press office comes back and says, no, Michael, you got to write some more. Okay, so I write some more. So I go up to maybe 200 words, maybe 250. Got another email, tried to ignore it. Of course, they know where I am and how to reach me. Got 3 or 4 more of these, and I finally just said, here's my resume, you write it. So, apologize, I appreciate the introduction, but I was listening to that and it's like, wow, it makes me sound like I'm really narcissistic. And, I mean, I may be, but I think I'm smart enough to try to hide it, but I came out early for this speaking engagement. It's one of the benefits of technology is I could get work done and be out here. And I just want to say how appreciative and honored I am about how welcoming all of you have been. I've spent some time with some folks at seeing their operations in their homes. I've talked to we had a nice long talk with the RCAF board. And I know you all are incredibly busy, far more busy than I am. I mean, the types of jobs, what you guys do for a living, that's real hard work. And so when you share your time, I know how valuable that is. And I guess to sort of start with the bottom line, if I accomplish nothing else today, what I do hope is that you understand that what you're doing, your advocacy, your tenacity, is having an effect. Maybe not as much as you want. That's fine. You should keep complaining until we get the job done. But that we are listening, we understand your concerns, and we are working on them. That enforcing the antitrust laws and the Packers and Stockyards Act is a particular priority for the Antitrust Division. In fact, my whole presence here today, and I'm not just talking that you gave me an invitation and I came, but the reason I'm here and working on this is you, RCAF, Bill Bullard, are the reason why. So let me tell you a little bit of a story. So 6 years ago, I was doing antitrust policy, and I went to a competition conference out in Madison, Wisconsin, in part because I was interested in learning about competition and agricultural issues, and in part because I was born and raised in Wisconsin, and my mother lived there, my sister lived there, and kind of a little efficiency there. So at one point in the conference, this guy named Bill Bullard gets up and gives a presentation on cattle markets. Now, I'd heard of Bill, hadn't met him. Now, none of what he said will surprise any of you. But as someone who had been doing competition law for their entire career and enforcing the antitrust laws, what his presentation stopped me dead in my tracks. So first he shows this graph showing the comparison, right, between the price the cattle versus the price at the retail level. And it starts out as you would expect, right? You would think that they would be highly correlated, right? When there's bigger demand for beef in the grocery store, retail prices should go up, but then that should trickle back to the producers. Conversely, if there isn't a lot of demand, prices should go down. This is like, economics 101. But in this graph it showed around about 2014, 2015, the cattle prices fall off a cliff, and the retail prices just keep going on their merry way much higher. I literally remember to this day going, what is going on there? That's not the way markets are supposed to work. So I thought, what gives, who benefits? Well, I don't know if Bill was reading my mind, because literally the next slide, he shows, when you look at the share of the retail dollar, beginning in 2018, you see a significant drop-off of what the producers were earning out of that dollar, and the packers increasing. Sort of like the packers seem to be winning, whether in good times or bad. And finally, it's like trying to, again, like this is very unsettled because I can't figure out what's going on. Third chart he puts up shows that as the number of meaningful buyers in a region declines in cattle markets, the value of the fed cattle declines. And that, what he showed was that decline can be more than $25 a head when you get down to only one buyer in an area. So look, you don't have to be a PhD economist or an expert in cattle markets to figure out that something dramatically changed. I mean, I figured that out, and I am neither. Like, I'm a lawyer, not clear what my value add. But it also struck me that those sorts of changes deserve an explanation. And in the 6 years since then, I have not heard anyone provide a benign explanation that would say we should have all have expected this to occur. And so that is really where I began looking and becoming interested in what's going on in competition in the cattle markets. And from there, I began to see that the problem in the cattle markets there's similar problems occurring in every livestock market. It's right, and I've learned about this term, chickenization. And I know all of you know this, but I just want to spell out my understanding. right? To me, it means you get concentration, so you got few buyers for the livestock. Those few buyers want to vertically integrate. Either they want to own up and down the distribution line, or they're going to do it by contract. And it often means that the packers and processors, what they seem to be wanting to do is they want to shift the risk to the producers, but not have to share the benefits. And in its worst form, which is why, right, in the poultry industry, you really sort of transform the entrepreneurs, the folks that breed and raise the livestock, the people who do the most work, are the most knowledgeable, the most concerned with quality, and turns them into sort of cogs in a wheel, or essentially just employees. And this started in the chicken industry. In the 90s, we began to see it developing in sheep and hog production. And the same sort of threat seems to exist now for cattle. And we're at a tipping point today. Over the past 40 years, we've lost something like 1,700 beef cattle operations a year, and maybe that comes from Bill's presentation. I probably should just put lots of footnotes, say, I'm actually not saying anything Bill didn't already teach me. And that's hard to comprehend until you look at what's happened to hog producers or dairy farms. And you don't need me to make the loss of one of those cattle operations tangible. I mean, I've spent the last week and the last years talking to folks, and you've explained to me, every operation lost is a family's income gone, a grandfather's dream to hand down that operation to the next generation destroyed. And those losses add up, and they spiral. Right? And so what we see right across rural America, once thriving towns are shuttered and silent, businesses disappear, schools funding can't find local sponsors, and without economic opportunity, people's children and their grandchildren, they have to leave, and they're not coming back. So these harms ripple throughout communities across rural America. And because rural America feeds this country, they ripple all across throughout all of America. Now, I'm just full of optimism today because I'm not going to tell you there are clearly many, many causes for these problems. But what I want to stress, what I view as what I do at the Justice Department, and what I believe this Antitrust Division believes, is to the degree violations of the antitrust laws or the Packers and Stockyards Act are contributing to these problems, the Antitrust Division has a role, no, a responsibility to address them. Because at the Antitrust Division, our responsibility is protecting free and fair competition in the United States economy. And we currently have a staff of 803 roughly to cover our $28 trillion economy. So today what I want to try to do with you is give a little background of what we do, the challenges we face in meeting our mission, what we have tangibly done in the last couple of years, but also what we need to do better and continue to work on. So I don't want to bore you with technical details about antitrust law, and trust me, I'm really good at that. Ask my wife. My daughter at one point in fourth grade had to write a persuasive essay, and literally she wrote about a very specific type of antitrust issue. Those were the days, right, when your daughter thinks her dad walks on water and does nothing wrong, and then they turn like 12. But I wanted to sort of try to give you sort of a non-technical explanation of what we do, so you can understand where we exist in the grand scope of potential help. Right, and so, I think this is fairly non-controversial. In the United States, we believe that competition delivers the best results. By competition, I mean that process of rivalry we see play out in the markets and participate in every single day as buyers, sellers, workers, and innovators. But when a group of actors, say competing businesses or a dominant firm, can thwart that rivalry, we all lose. So the antitrust laws, the focus is on an action, whether it be two companies merging or an agreement between two companies or a practice, distorts that competition. The Justice Department is the primary enforcer of the antitrust laws at the federal level. But we also have a role with the Department of Justice in enforcing the Packers and Stockyards Act. That act, passed in 1921, has some provisions that sort of look like antitrust law on steroids. They literally seem to write this to deal with, at the time, legal decisions that the Congress did not agree with under the antitrust laws. But actually, that's the small part of the Packers and Stockyards Act. It also explicitly is directed at protecting livestock producers from deception, unfairness, unjust discrimination. And so, whereas the antitrust laws are about how does conduct affect rivalry, the Packers and Stockyards says that's one possible problem. But we get that just as a matter of course, we're generally going to have very large packers dealing with small independent producers, and so we're going to put a thumb on the scale of protecting those producers. So, things like deception, unfairness, unfairly treating somebody, those can affect competition, but they may not affect competition. They still harm people. And that was a judgment Congress made in 1921. So if I'm you right now, candidly, I'm like, well, that's great. He's heard what we said. What are you doing about it? And that's a fair point. So before I get to that, I do want to give you a sense of, as we look at enforcement, some of the issues we have to navigate to try to get to the right results. And I want to be clear, none of these challenges am I laying out for you are excuses for what the government has not been able to accomplish. They are not, I am not using them to blame other people who made different decisions, but they are real. And one of the things I've learned doing antitrust enforcement is you have to acknowledge what the hurdles are so you can figure out how you're going to jump over them. So first, I've been talking a lot about antitrust laws and competition, but if you were to be, as I was at the FTC in the 2000s and the 2010s, or in antitrust generally, there was a real focus that the problem with the lack of competition was it harms buyers and consumers. And certainly that is a problem where we have collusion and monopolization. But we sort of forgot that market power and dominance can also hurt sellers. So we went through a generation of everyone just sort of thinking about how does conduct harm consumers, whereas we need to be thinking about, is there a disruption in competition, and who's ever harmed by that, it's a problem. Second, over time, antitrust enforcement, which the Supreme Court calls the Magna Carta of economic liberty, transformed itself into this highly technical approach, measuring, sort of trying to quantify difficult measurements and complicated weighing, rather than just focused on, if you're harming competition, it's a problem. And so the derivative effects of that was it made it harder for the agencies. They set their own bar for bringing cases higher. We became very risk averse, because if you start bringing fewer cases, each individual case matters, and then if you lose, it becomes a catastrophe. And as you guys know, since you've been on the front run of this fight, this has also infected Packers and Stockyards Act. And since the mid-2000s, the term competitive injury or harm to competition has slipped into the case law. And generally when a court uses that term, it means the Packer's going to win the case and the producer's going to lose the case. Third, in a very real sense, resources. right? At the end of the day, the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission, we can only spend the money we have to hire people and bring cases. When we bring antitrust cases, they tend to be very expensive. It's one of the few areas probably where the government is at a disadvantage against the companies it's litigating against. We go into court and we have a team of 5, 6, 7 people, and they fill up the rest of the courtroom with very smart lawyers and people working 24/7. I kind of like that, but it is true. You can't bring cases if you don't have enough people, or you got to limit the number you can. And let me just give you a quick statistics, right? So if you look at the funding for antitrust enforcement between 2010 and 2018, it increased 3%. The economy, which we oversee, increased 37%. Essentially, we had the exact same resources to police an economy that was a third larger than when we started. Again, not an excuse, it is the constraint that exists. So I would like, so try to not be just a total downer Debbie. So over the past 4 years, the Antitrust Division's enforcement has reached historic level. And let me focus on a couple areas that I think most interesting to you are. One is refocusing antitrust to be about harm to sellers as well as buyers. So last year, we updated our merger guidelines, which sort of tells the world how we think about when a merger is illegal under the law. And before we had updated these guidelines, we talked to folks from all walks of life and held listening sessions around the country. We received thousands of comments on those mergers and on how mergers and concentrations affected people in their daily lives. And we took those to heart. Many of you submitted comments, RCAF submitted comments, and we appreciate that. And we listened to that, and that affected how we wrote those guidelines. And the final document has an entire section that talks about when we think a merger harms workers or sellers or producers. We also explained that we weren't going to just look at whether we think a merger is going to increase price or lower price, right? We're going to look at whether, again, we had an entire section about when do we think a dominant firm, if it buys another firm, is it just sort of building a moat around itself to protect itself from competition? And I think these all reflect ideas you all, either directly or through RCAF, presented to us. But we didn't just put out a policy paper, because that's actually kind of easy in Washington, D.C. We've actually acted on those principles. In 2022, we blocked a major merger between 2 of the largest publishing houses. And the theory there that we said why this was problematic was there's really only 4 major publishers that compete for authors in a real sense. And if you get rid of one of them, there's less competition. These authors are going to earn less. So we weren't, this wasn't about, oh my God, prices of books are going up. This is about the people doing the work, creating the books. They're going to be harmed. We won. Admittedly, it can help when your first witness is Stephen King, in being badgered on cross-examination, he quips, "This merger is scarier than any book I have ever written." I also want to talk a little bit about what we were doing in agriculture. It's good. We have brought cases in every sector of the distribution. So we have challenged information sharing amongst the processors that we have alleged increased prices for turkey, poultry, and pork products at the retail level. We shut down another information exchange that was processors sharing information amongst themselves on wages, benefits. We thought that the result of that was workers were making less. And in cooperation with the USDA, we brought the first and indeed the second Packers and Stockyard case initiated by the Department of Justice. Now the first, they're both in poultry. Now the first alleges that Wayne Sanderson's use of penalties in tournament systems is deceptive because growers can't actually have a sense of what risks they take by becoming growers and participating in the system. And in a historic settlement, Wayne Sanderson agreed that they would stop penalizing people and would also limit the amount of money they put into the bonus pool vis-a-vis the base pay, so that they couldn't just get around this limit on penalty by putting all the compensation in the base. In the second case, Cook Foods was penalizing chicken growers who were switching to a competing processor. We allege that practice violated both the antitrust laws and the Stockyards Act. And Cook settled, agreed not to do it anymore, and returned the money it had collected from the processors who had paid the penalty and those who had had to hire lawyers to protect themselves. What I want to stress here, because again, I'm not talking about, I know you're sitting there, where's the beef, dude? Like, in both cases, you can look at that complaint. You're not going to find the term competitive harm or injury to competition. Though the theories in those complaints are when the processor abuses its dominance in the market that harms producers, that violates the Packers and Stockyards Act, full stop. That principle, we are working to enshrine that principle, and enshrine is wrong. I would say we are working to restore that principle because that's what the statute intended, that's what the original case law said, and that has meaning not just for chicken producers, for you, it has meaning for what happens in cattle markets, in hog markets, and it is a small step. And I'm not going to overread that step, but I think it is an important sign that the government, the Department of Justice, is taking the position that you all have long advocated about the power inherent in the Packers and Stockyards Act to protect independent producers. So the question I jumped to my where's the beef joke, so moving on. Now, so I want to be clear here, we have more work to do. And so I'm not here to take any victory lap. And one of the ways you do more is good policy follows personnel. So what I want to tell you today, and I'm announcing, is that we are going to expand, we are using the extra money we've gotten, and we're going to expand the number of attorneys, and we are going to dedicate a group of those attorneys to focus specifically on agriculture and livestock issues. We are going to make that clear. We're going to make that clear in the announcement. We're going to have them run out of Chicago because Chicago is a lot closer to rural America and the farms and the livestock producers and the feedlots. They're going to be looking at things both from what we traditionally civil enforcement, but also for potential criminal enforcement. And so one last thing, I'm going to go over a little bit, I apologize. So I'm being very candid with you about where I think we need to do more and what remains to be done. And I am, as some of you have heard me say this week, it's never going to bother me when you tell me we're not doing enough or we're not doing our job well, because we work for you and we work to enforce the law. And so, but there is one area I want to talk a little bit where we can use some help. And in particular, we've been hearing more and more about conduct at sale barn auctions that seems problematic. Buyers seeming we've heard examples of people saying, well, the buyers will sit there and draw cards to determine who bids in what order, or magically, if there's 3 buyers, 2 of them always seem to be out of the room when the bid's occurring. That all is really troubling for us. And we want to make sure nothing, that if that kind of conduct is going on and it violates the antitrust laws, we will focus on that immediately, but we need help gathering information. And so, I didn't bring, outside, I brought a little two-sided half sheet to tell you the types of conduct particularly that seems to be problematic and that we've heard about. So you know what in that area we're looking for. It's not, also, backside will tell you how to contact us or the USDA, and it will explain that when you come to us in private, the law provides significant amount of confidentiality, and we will protect what we are told to the fullest extent of the law. So, as I wrap up, I want to be clear. Vigorous enforcement and antitrust enforcement and restoring the packers and stockyards to its original meaning, it's not a silver bullet that's going to make your lives easy. But failing to do it just makes it worse. And those failures ripple throughout your economy, your communities. So again, I just want to say how glad I am to be here and how glad I am to be part of this fight. And I don't know, you guys are probably asleep because it's post-lunch, so I don't have to say, you don't need to applaud me because there's just simply more work to be done. And I want you all to hold us accountable every step of the way. I and the Antitrust Division, we won't rest until we've delivered actual results. Thank you.
We've got time for 2 or 3 questions. Anybody have any questions?
I was trying to filibuster. Damn.
Sorry, buddy.
No, please.
Michael?
Yes.
Mike Schultz from Kansas. Thank you for coming. My concern with antitrust at Everett has been all along for several years. We've had issues with this over people being concerned about the fear of retaliation. When I was involved in the price reporting meetings, you don't have to talk, but you know of the big 4 packers who's buying what. So if somebody complains too loudly, I'm concerned about confidentiality in that regard for the people that are willing to talk. And I know everything is said that, well, it's all going to be a confidential deal, but they know who they're doing that to, Packers. Okay.
So, look, I totally understand that concern. And people have to make the best decision for them, and I'm never going to second guess someone who decides I'm not talking to the government because I just don't. I'm concerned the confidentiality won't be protected, or the people will be able to figure it out. That's a decision you have to make. The one thing I would acknowledge that does make it harder for us to do our job. That's a challenge we have to figure out to get along. And I would encourage you at least, reach out and find and let the attorneys at the Antitrust Division explain to you exactly what those confidentiality protections are. I think one of the things that was a mistake back in 2010 is the agency went out and did all these public hearings about all the problems, and people came forward and they were public and there was a transcript, and shockingly, people paid a price for that. What we are asking for is very different. But so I would say, educate yourself on the confidentiality, and then, my view is you will make, whatever decision's best for you, that's the right decision to make. The second thing I would say is, one of the ways we can try to avoid that problem is thinking about building cases that rely less on testimony from people who are harmed. That can be more challenging because we like to be able to go to a court and say, here are the people who are harmed, Judge. We're not just pinhead Washington attorneys. Okay, we are pinhead Washington attorneys, but listen to the witnesses. But we can try cases without that. We do that all the time, actually, and it's harder, but that's also something we think about on a daily basis.
We've got one over here.
First, my apologies to all of my fellow members. I am kind of shy, but I do have a question for Michael. I mean, we know the Packers and the collusion there, but you mentioned the loss of our independent feeders, and in this room we have Eric Nelson and Rick Chambers that feed cattle, and the Weinreich brothers or their family. But the Packers are an easy target, but the feeding industry, Foots in Kansas, Adams in Nebraska, Cactus in Texas. Have you looked at the concentration in the feeding industry? We've lost all the independents, but the cattle are being fed by these big guys. Is that something you guys are considering?
Absolutely. I mean, I should have been clearer. I mean, I think this relates to the chickenization of the industry. Is, even if you don't own, in the chicken industry, they basically own everything but the chicken barn and the people who raise the chickens. But that isn't the only way you can get the chickenization. You can do it by contract and eliminate competition upstream, upstream at the feedlot level. And yes, this is something that worries us. And we are very much thinking about whether there's an antitrust violation in that dynamic and how to bring that case.
Got another one over here if we have time.
Ronnie Rogers from Kansas. We feed some cattle, and Packer asked for time on these cattle, and it went by a week, and then 10 days, then 2 weeks. They finally picked the cattle up, and now I understand they're talking about buying cattle with time and asking for as much as 3 weeks. Is there any designation on that?
So I'm going to say this. I will be here the rest of the day, and you all feel free to come talk to me. I probably need to understand a little bit more about what's going on. That's another thing we've been trying to stress with our attorneys, that actually the antitrust part of any antitrust case is actually easier than just understanding what's actually going on, so you can understand how certain things are problematic. So I don't want to overstep my bounds, but would be happy to sit down with you and listen to you and give you at least some thoughts on what might be going on or what might be actionable. Oh, one last thing. Mention these cards, and I'll get in trouble if I don't do everything to push them out. They look like this. This is what to look for and how to contact us. So again, thank you so much for giving me your time, and